bringing together the ambassadors of international organizations, the ILO. I would like to welcome you all. I have the great honor and the great pleasure to welcome Ambassador Jean-David Levitte, the international advisor to the President of the French Republic, and Sherpa to the G20s, who has been kind enough to come here and to tell us about the work undertaken by the G20 in the light of the summit that will be held in Cannes on the 2nd and 3rd of November. Jean-David Levitte is very well placed to carry out this exercise and to do this here, since his experience has enabled him to acquire information that is very important on international organizations and the way that they function. As diplomatic advisor and Sherpa, he has carried out this function also with President Chirac from 1995 to the year 2000. Subsequently, he was permanent representative of the United Nations in New York and French ambassador in the United States. We should also remember that Ambassador Levitte has been permanent ambassador here in Geneva from 1998 to 2010, and he has remained for us a great friend at the ILO and has made his mark. So you have come back home to an extent. You're very welcome here, Mr. Levitte. Through his experience and his career, Mr. Levitte is carrying out through some very troubled times the work of the G20 with the competence of all the actors concerned. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I have great confidence in the friendship that he has expressed to our organization and the work that has been carried out in the meeting of the Minister of Employment and Labor of the G20. This has led to some very important conclusions on 4 subjects in particular, on employment, but also the social protection floors, social rights, and coherence of policies. Having participated in that work, I'm very happy to see the way that the work has been prepared together with the governing body of the ILO and the ambassador of President Sarkozy. I'm sorry, there's a technical problem. Taking into account the recommendations in the final communiqué of the Cannes Summit. The ILO, since June 2009, the French Republic has stressed the need to bring together social and economic factors in guiding globalization and to strengthen the role of the ILO. I would also like to recall the key role that has been played in order to enable the ILO to be present in the G20, and also his will to bring together to involve the social partners in this work. We have had proof once again a few days ago in Paris that the ILO can note this with great satisfaction. In conclusion, Ambassador, I would like to point out that I want to mention that this Cannes Summit will be held in a context that is marked by the great difficulties that the world economy is going through, with a background of a substantial slowdown in economic growth, with its repercussions on employment, enterprises, entrepreneurs and workers. We have noted the concerns expressed by those who are involved with us in the light of the crisis that seems to be gaining depth. And I think that this capacity for being au fait with the realities of the life and work of people in their everyday life that we want to stress the context that this meeting is taking place. It's more important than ever to bring together the financial, financial, economic, social protection policies in order to ensure that we have a global economic growth that will take place in the near future. And so it is with great satisfaction and happiness that I'm giving you the floor now, Ambassador. Thank you.
Merci.
I would like to thank the Director General for these very flattering words. Ladies and gentlemen, Directors General, ambassadors, dear colleagues, it is for me a great honor to be again here among you in Geneva. And first of all, I would like to thank for his invitation my friend, the Director General of the ILO, Mr. Juan Somavia. I would also like to say that it is with great regret and great sadness that we have heard his decision to put an end to his mandate in exactly a year from now. Juan, you have carried out a tremendously interesting road in your work here, and we have a year yet before us to work together to make progress on the path that you have traced for us in such a brilliant fashion. I'm also very happy to be here in this room and to meet again a number of people that I already know well, and in particular I have in mind the Ambassador of China, the Ambassador of Japan as well. All they too were Sherpa colleagues of mine in a previous lifetime. But I'm particularly happy to see that this meeting between the current presidency of the G20 and the international community of Geneva become now a vital and regular occurrence. And I would like to pay tribute to the work that has been carried out by the previous presidency, by Korea, in order to inform and involve all the United Nations in the work of the G20. France has launched itself wholeheartedly into the furrow that has been already drawn by our friends in Korea. France accords vital importance to the opening up of the G20 to the whole of the international community. The G20 cannot, the G20 must not become a closed club. Even if the member countries of the G20 represents 85% of the global GDP, opening up to others is a prerequisite of its legitimacy. As you know, President Sarkozy has devoted the beginning of his French presidency to consultations. In January, he went to Addis Ababa, meeting together African heads of state who met during the meeting of the African Union. He has carried out many consultations, both within and without the G20. He consulted with heads of states, with governments, of course, but also leaders of international organizations. And also he has met with representatives of unions, enterprises, and civil society. He will continue to do this during that time between here and the summit in Cannes. On Wednesday, for instance, he will meet with the leaders of the International Organization of French-Speaking Countries, the OIF, and the Commonwealth. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a very useful year of presidency that has seen progress and results made throughout the year. Rather than concentrating on one single event, such as the summit, I will come back in a little while from now on the work that has been carried out. But as of now, I would like to thank all international organizations and in particular specialized institutions from Geneva who have contributed very effectively to the agenda of our presidency. But of course, and one mentioned this just now, given the global economic situation, the Cannes Summit, above all, will have to concentrate on a response to the crisis, which affects not only the Eurozone, affects not only the United States, but also affects emerging economies, and therefore all the economies of developing countries. The G20, from its very beginning, demonstrated in November 2008 in Washington and then in April 2009 in London, has demonstrated that it was able to be effective in facing up to the crisis. The message at the time was quite clear. We needed to repair the financial system. We needed to commit ourselves to give up protectionism in order to avoid a repetition of mistakes made in the 1930s. And we had to coordinate recovery efforts. I would add, of course, the reform of international financial institutions, which has enabled us to see a rebalancing exercise, which has become vital for the benefit of emerging countries. That was 2008, 2009. We were beginning to think that in 2010 that the G20 in the future would have to reinvent itself in order to manage the post-crisis period. But recent economic development noted in developed countries as well as in the emerging countries has led us back to crisis management. And that, therefore, will be the absolute priority at the Cannes Summit. We would hope that in Cannes, the G20 would be in a position to adopt a real plan of action in order to promote global growth. It will have to do, in order to do this, it will have to base itself on very specific economic policy measures taken by the major powers. And I have in mind, of course, the United States, China, the Eurozone states, but also in Japan, in the United Kingdom, and in Brazil. I'm not going to go in detail through here what we expect from everyone. You understand that we will save those discussions for our bilateral exchanges with each of our partners. I don't need either to stress before you the difficulty of the task facing us. The message of London, the message of Washington could be unequivocally that of recovery. The message of Cannes will have to be rather more differentiated. Some states need to concentrate on measures to support the economy. Other states would have to concentrate on the consolidation of their public finances. Yet others would have to concentrate on the rebalancing of their economic model in order to promote domestic consumption. Now, I know that many here in this room feel that, first of all, it's up to the Eurozone to regulate its problems before asking other states to make an effort. And here I have two messages on this subject. The first message is that the Eurozone will do what it has to do. The ratification of the package of the 21st of July on the IMF is in excellent spirits, especially after the massive effect of the Bundestag in Germany and the Troika made up of the IMF, the European Central Bank and the European Commission is right now in Athens, where it's concluding its work and will produce a report in the coming few days. President Sarkozy on Friday met with the Prime Minister Papandreou, and he will go to Berlin in order to meet with Chancellor Angela Merkel, with whom he has permanent contact. We are totally committed to helping Greece and, of course, to safeguard the future of the euro, the eurozone, and therefore of the European Union. My second message is to underline how vain it might be to look for those responsible for the financial crisis. We need to concentrate on solutions to be applied to the crisis. I want to remind you that after the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, we did not stand aside waiting for the United States to deal with its banking system. At that time, we all wanted to set up strong cooperation between those countries principally affected by the financial crisis, because that was the only way to be able to meet that particular challenge. And today it's the same thing. Nobody is sheltered from the economic crisis. Nobody can speculate on the failures of others, because the interdependence of our economies means that there's automatically rapid transmission of disbalances. And that is why France would like to call today on all the countries of the G20 to take the necessary measures adapted to the situation, and all countries non-members of the G20 to support the collective efforts that will be undertaken in order to restore confidence. Dear friends, nevertheless, the Cannes Summit, even dominated by this theme of growth and restoration of confidence, will not limit itself to simply the plan of action that we want to adopt there. We want to mark progress made on new subjects included on the G20 agenda by France at the end of 2010, such as the reform of the international monetary system or the fight against excessive price volatility. These are topics that are not only useful for better regulation of globalization, but they are also a subject that are complementary elements to the plan of action for growth. Who can fail to see that it is vital to make progress towards a new international monetary order which reflects the new economic realities and avoiding currency exchange market disbalances, which last year almost deteriorated into a currency exchange war? Who can fail to understand that disorders on commodity markets, which have led to excessive fluctuations in agricultural and energy prices, represent a break to global growth, and more seriously still, are directly responsible for humanitarian disasters? And so, ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, allow me to come back a little more in detail on those subjects, starting with the international monetary system, a vital element in the framework for sustainable, strong, and balanced growth. The G20 decided on 9 specific pillars of reform since the very successful seminar held in Nankin the 31st of March, co-organized by China and France. And I will mention the main 4 pillars. The first one is a composition of special drawing rights of the IMF. The G20 is working in particular on integration criteria for new currencies in the special drawing rights basket. Second, the second pillar is a reference framework for the management of capital flows. We need to have common references in order to respond to sudden capital in or outflows. And here I have in mind a number of emerging countries, such as Brazil, for instance, who had to face this kind of situation. The third pillar is the strengthening of our response to systemic shocks through the establishment of IMF lines of credit, this time aimed at countries that are well managed but nevertheless exposed to the global crisis. Moreover, we would like the IMF to articulate as well as possible its instruments together with the mutual support funds created by Europe, together with the European Financial Stabilization Fund, or in Asia with the Chiang Mai Agreement. The fourth pillar, finally, the G20 is working on strengthening multilateral surveillance of the IMF, in particular dealing with the effects of financial economic contagion through one country or one zone on the rest of the world. Dear friends, among the structural responses to the crisis, I would in particular, here in this room at the ILO, I would like to stress how important it is for us that the economic agenda should integrate an ambitious social agenda within it. And once again, I would like to thank the organization that is hosting this meeting today and its Director General for the work that we have carried out together. We have been able, at the request of President Sarkozy, I think we have been able to anchor the social dimension of globalization in the work agenda of the G20. And not just to include an additional item, but to stress that the response to the crisis would be efficient only if it manages to integrate a renewed and shared concern for employment, for social protection, and for social rights. Last week, Juan said this, that the Minister of Employment finalized an agreement which will enable the G20 to make progress in this vital field over the coming years. We have been able to obtain the support of all the members of the G20 to the concept of social protection floors in a plural, and the initiative of the United Nations that has been developed along those lines. The conclusions of the International Labour Conference that was held here at the ILO in June, as well as the recommendations of the consultative group chaired by Michel Bachelet, were totally taken into account. Of course, and I stress this, the social protection floors are defined at the national level and need to take into account the specificities of each country. But their usefulness has certainly been stressed by all. The international organizations play a central role in the implementation of the G20 agenda. I have already said this, but I would like to repeat this. This is particularly true in the social field in particular. We have therefore given you agreement to the G20, and I would like to thank you very much for that, to set up a mechanism for coordination and for consultation and to provide a platform for knowledge sharing on good practices in the field of social protection. This should be operational by the G20 Mexico Summit in June of next year. President Sarkozy would also like to see the setting up as quickly as possible of observer posts set up jointly by the WTO and the ILO in order to strengthen further the consistency of the work undertaken by your two organizations.
France would like the 8 fundamental ILO standards to be ratified everywhere, respected, and reported on. I know how difficult debates were on this matter and how hard it will be to make progress. But France is determined to pursue this struggle and will be unstinting. And finally, the ministerial meeting of the G20 last week placed employment at the head of its priorities. This is a concern that we all share. Thanks to the hard work and devotion of Gilles de Robien, and I thank him for his presence and his excellent work. Thanks to his capacity of conviction, we have succeeded, and not without difficulty, we have to admit, to make long-standing the annual holding of the ministerial employment meeting of G20 countries, but also the existence of a dedicated working group, this famous task force, allowing for the association of trade union organizations in the reflections of governments for employment. This is a key objective of any economic policy and a vector of growth. And I finally would like to add that for the first time this year, the G20 presidency decided to facilitate the organization of a Labor 20 alongside a Business 20. France hopes that Mexico and the following presidencies will repeat this experience each year. And why not say so, dear friends? We are very pleased that we played a lead role in assuring the presence, which is now a fact, of the ILO Director General at all of the summits. Ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, allow me to come to the issues for Cannes. They are not new because they have been on the agenda since the Washington Summit, but we have worked a great deal on them in order to achieve new concrete progress. First of all, with respect to financial regulation, the G20 strategy is based on a simple principle since Washington. And this principle is the following: all stakeholders, all markets, and all products have to be subject to rules and to appropriate monitoring. The regulation of globalization is also made possible, and I would say perhaps especially through rules applicable to the financial sector. Under the French presidency, the G20 worked on the implementation of commitments assumed at previous summits, in particular at Pittsburgh, and on new objectives. The G20 has thus adopted scaled-up measures for systemic major banks. We are now working on extending regulation to non-banking entities and activities such as the supervision of the parallel banking system, what is called shadow banking, and the protection of users of financial services, and finally, on the regulation of commodities derivatives. We have also achieved new progress in the combat against what is called non-cooperative countries and territories, and especially with respect to tax havens, and this will be a major subject in Cannes. We're working towards an in-depth evaluation of progress accomplished by some 60 countries in observance of rules for the exchange of information and on the fight against money laundering and financing of terrorism. We hope that the G20 will sign the Multilateral Convention on Administrative Assistance on Fiscal Matters in Cannes. Almost all of the G20 countries have committed themselves to signing it, and we have 1 month remaining to persuade the last countries to follow suit. Dear friends, with respect to the development agenda now, we are implementing the mandate entrusted upon us in Seoul. Under our presidency and in close association with Korea and with South Africa, who co-presided the working group with us during this entire year, we have made significant progress on the 9 pillars comprising the Seoul Action Plan. In addition, and for the first time, the G20 held a ministerial meeting on development on September 23rd last in Washington. Our presidency shall organize 2 weeks prior to the summit, on October 21st in Paris, a major conference on mobilization for development. This conference will be opened by the President of the Republic. The civil society will be invited to join its efforts to those of governments. With the agreement of all of our partners in the G20, this year we especially focused on 3 subjects that are particularly crucial, namely food security, infrastructures, and the financing of development. And you know, for France, we have a particular interest in innovative financing. With respect to food security, first of all, we have already achieved results, even if, of course, the international community's priority these past months has been on the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Horn of Africa. And a number of institutions here in Geneva are involved in this effort. The ministers of agriculture of the G20 adopted a major plan of action last June, an ambitious one, and I would like to mention 2 measures that are already in place. First of all, an information system on the physical agricultural data, in other words, where the stocks are. This has been managed by the Food and Agricultural Organization. It is called AMIS, Agricultural Market Information System, and will strengthen the transparency of markets and thus enable them to become more stable. Second, a rapid response forum, still at the FAO, which is going to associate countries playing a significant role on world agricultural markets and is aimed at improving international emergency coordination. The idea behind this is very simple. When a producer country signals a supply-related problem which may have an impact on consumers, it acts immediately. And in the same way, the major consumer countries that may have problems also signal this immediately. And with the collection of this data, we are able to have more effective and a more rapid response. France is also very committed to the G20 supporting a number of initiatives to protect better the most vulnerable countries from the consequences of excessive volatility of agricultural commodities prices. Here I am thinking in particular of a pilot project under the auspices of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of the West African States, of pre-positioned emergency humanitarian food reserves. The success of this project shall then enable extending this initiative to other areas of the world. The French presidency also wishes to encourage the G20 countries to commit to not imposing restrictions on exports of agricultural products, food products, that the World Food Program needs in case of humanitarian emergencies. And finally, and as you know full well, France believes that the main policy to improve sustainably global food security is to scale up investment in agriculture in each one of the major areas of the world. We have to increase global agricultural production by 70% before 2050 if we want to assume our responsibilities and feed the entire world's population. It is therefore in all regions of the world that we have to encourage production, but of course we have to focus our efforts first on Africa by way of priority. With respect to development, the second priority has to do with infrastructures. The absence of infrastructure is one of the main obstacles to development in many regions of the world, and first of all, in Africa. The G20 has entrusted a high-level panel for infrastructure, for which we have conferred the presidency to Mr. Tidjane Thiam, to draw up concrete and innovative recommendations to encourage and scale up investment in infrastructure in developing countries. From now until Cannes, we hope to identify lead infrastructure projects which would privilege the regional level as far as possible and which would have a maximum impact on economic development. We shall strive for G20's efforts in developing infrastructure to remain focused on low-income countries with a strong priority for Africa. And finally, with respect to financing of development, President Sarkozy has requested Bill Gates to present at the Cannes Summit proposals for heads of state and government to renew their commitments and promote financial innovation for new means of financing. We hope that Bill Gates' report shall mention common objectives for public aid for development. France is very attached to this, and it has also maintained its considerable budgetary effort despite the present situation of our public financing. Last year, in 2010, the level of our public development aid was 0.5% of our GDP. In his report, Bill Gates shall propose a menu of options containing innovative financial mechanisms of different types. We shall propose to each G20 country to take a stance with respect to this menu and put into effect at least one of the options proposed by Bill Gates. And you will not be surprised by the fact that France, for its part, considers that the financial transaction tax is the most effective and most important mechanism. This tax is technically feasible. With our German partners, we have proposed concrete and precise modalities. The European Commission, in a few days' time, will present its project in this regard, with the support of the civil society and the support of world opinion. asking governments to move on this issue, we do hope to convince people not only about the feasibility of such a tax, but also about the need for this tax in order to face up to the major development challenges. I am thinking about the Millennium Development Goals, and I'm also thinking about climate change and the threat of global warming. Several countries that are not members of the European Union have already demonstrated their interest. I'm thinking about several African countries such as Mali, Benin, Burkina Faso, the Congo, Guinea, Mauritania, Senegal, Togo. And I am availing myself of this opportunity to make an appeal to other countries to join us in the time up to Cannes, to create a movement to proceed from rhetoric to action. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, since we are in Geneva, and especially since trade makes a major contribution to world growth, I would not like to conclude without mentioning trade issues. The 8th Ministerial of the WTO will take place here in Geneva from the 15th to the 17th of December. And you know that it is here in Geneva that continuation of negotiations within the Doha mandate are very difficult, and that is a diplomatic euphemism. And it's for this reason that the French presidency of the G20 would like the G20 to launch a dynamic of reflection on the strengthening of the World Trade Organization. Our objective is to show the attachment of all of our countries to trade multilateralism. The WTO, and I say this very emphatically, is the best protection against the law of the jungle. Its capacity to settle disputes must not only be preserved, but it must also be strengthened. I do not wish to say any more. While the experts, including you, meet with one another every day here in Geneva and exchange amongst themselves coded messages that only they are able to decipher. But France would like a message of trust in the WTO and in the fight against protectionism to be adopted in Cannes. We would also like measures on behalf of LDCs to be taken as quickly as possible, of course, because that is at the heart of the trade negotiations mandate. And I'll come back to my first subject, the plan of action for growth. No one should be left along the wayside. We will be able to maintain world growth only if everyone does his bit, and if we all together help the LDCs to remain afloat, make their contribution to world growth. Dear friends, the Cannes Summit agenda, as you have noticed, is a very heavy one, and we are facing a crisis of considerable scope. This means concrete decisions, strong decisions, and a very clear message on growth. You have also observed that we have made a great deal of progress with respect to long-term stakes, and we are very confident about the commitment in Mexico to continue this work in 2012. We are exactly 1 month to the day from the Cannes Summit, which will start on November 3rd. Much still remains to be done. The synergy between the G20, the United Nations, and particularly the specialized agencies that you represent, and the entire international community, this synergy is absolutely essential in order to succeed. More than ever before, we need all of you. Thank you.
Eh bien, merci. Pardon. Merci, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That was very thorough and very illustrative. We would like to have a question and answer session. You have forms for requesting to take the floor, and I ask you to fill them out and submit them. We have the speaker, Mr. Peñalosa, who is responsible for the employer section.
Say first of all, my best wishes and my warmest support for the stimulating year you have in front of you. You know you count on us. À travers vous, Monsieur Levitte, et aussi Monsieur Robien qui est avec vous, I would like to thank the French government for the well-organized G20 process and for the opportunities for participation offered to the employers. Today, I'm going to concentrate myself in the social and labor dimension, but we fully appreciate the information you provided us on all that you have presented this morning. I would like also to thank the G20 governments for their ongoing commitment to dialogue on social policy issues and to working with employers and workers' organizations. I think this is a very important step you took, and the government of France has given a tremendous step forward for the collaboration of the business community and the trade unions with the G20. The position of the employers for the G20 are reflected in a paper that we have presented, and we have copies available here for those who want to have a copy, but also in our webpage you can have it in the 3 languages. But there are 2 striking points that came from consensus last Monday. First, the recognition of the economic threat the world now faces. And second, the likely impact on employment and the importance that should be accorded to jobs in the current climate. From the employers group, we trust that the outcome of the Paris discussion will result in real attention paid to jobs when the leaders meet in Cannes. I would like to highlight there are some specific points which give us some hope is going to happen. The priority that you have given to youth employment, but also the priority you have accorded to a training strategy. And also, it is very important what you have agreed, the Ministers of Labour, the recognition that the social protection floor, it is a reality, it's an acceptance, and there is no single international floor applied in all countries. The ministers last Monday have had some positive outcomes. However, we still face a central economic and policy challenge, which was the central message the business community gave to the G20. First, there is a need of sufficient economic growth to generate jobs. And second, there is a need to adopt specific measures to make employers more confident to create new work opportunities. Let me say a final word in relation to one suggestion that you have mentioned, and for us is the utmost importance, is this creation of the G20 task force on employment, which is going to begin working on youth development. We see that this task force will not directly involve employers and workers' representatives, but you may consult them, or you are going to consult them. We encourage you that this task force ensure that this rapidly occurs, and the employers and unions become an indispensable tool in the machinery of this task force. And lastly, the views of the real economy, and particularly of those who are actually making decisions to create jobs, should be critical for the success of the task force. So employers and unions are going to be indispensable for whatever thing that you may decide to go forward in this task force. Thank you very much for the time. Thank you.
Je vous remercie de...
Thank you very much for this comment, which doesn't really require a response. It wasn't really a question, but a statement with which I can fully go along with. On the eve of the Cannes Summit, on the 2nd of November, in Cannes itself, we will hold two meetings. One, which is a traditional one, that's Business 20, and the other one, which will be a first, but we hope will be repeated from summit to summit, which will be Labour 20. And what we would like to see is that both are able to dialogue informally, either separately or together, that both of them should fuel thoughts for heads of states and for governments. And the government and the task force, that was the idea that we had. That's how it should operate, as far as France was concerned. At any rate, that's how we saw it. It's vital for employers and union representatives to be associated in this reflection exercise. There can't be any growth without job creation, and there can't be any job creation without growth. So how do we go forward? Well, I'd like to come back to the first summit that was suggested by President Sarkozy, in fact, in November 2008 in Washington. We are in a very different situation from that. At that time, we were faced with a single crisis, a banking crisis, a financial crisis, which became an economic crisis. Now, today, the states represented in the G20, and beyond that, the states that you represent, are faced with very differing situations. So there isn't one single menu that can be used to respond to the crisis. Each and every one has to make his contribution in the light of the situation prevailing in their country. And we have to be sure that nobody ducks out of making a contribution when it comes to the idea that the Eurozone crisis should be sorted out first, and after that we'll see. The fact is that in the Eurozone, once that problem is sorted out, we'll come up with the US problems and Obama and the Congress. And if we're waiting for the Eurozone problems to be sorted, and we have to wait for the US problems to be sorted, and then we'll see. Now, that would be a recipe for disaster. We're quite convinced that we have 1 month, and that's not much time, it's very short, 1 month, to set up the basis of a plan of action where each and every country will be able to make a contribution. And when I say each and every country, that's the countries of the G20, of course. As it was mentioned, we represent 85% of the global GDP. But beyond that, there is a need for all the countries to make a contribution. And here in this room, I'm very happy to be able to stress how much we are in agreement with the accent laid on the social dimension of growth. Employment is at the very heart of the program of action that we hope to see adopted in Cannes. And it's obvious that after Cannes, it'll be up to the Mexican presidency to continue the work. And so this We're calling for general mobilization, not only the governments of the G20, not only the governments beyond that, but all the stakeholders in economic life. Together, we can restart the economic driving force. If we start competing with each other, conflict with each other, climate of distrust, then we will be doomed to failure in Cannes, and we can all imagine what that would lead to. If we go together with a full conviction that, as it is, as we say in our UN jargon, we need to have a common approach, but a differentiated one. Common because we're on the same boat, but differentiated because we're all different. We all have a will to make a contribution, nevertheless. We would then have a great Cannes summit, if that is the case. And if Cannes can manage to send a message of confidence, of a positive message, then we'll be able to relaunch and restart the economic engine. And that is the conviction that President Sarkozy has, and that's the conviction of the governments of the G20, and that is the spirit that we're preparing the summit for in a month's time.
While listening to you in the ILO language, I think you're thinking about a global pact for growth and employment. There's 85% of the countries, but I think that everyone throughout the world is involved. And I think that it's this pact that is going to help us find a way out of this crisis. Ambassador Feder, Luxembourg, to be followed by Gonzalez from the ITUC. Ambassador, please. Thank you, Director General. I first of all would like to welcome this cooperation between you, Director General, and your organization, and the French presidency of the G20. And the distinguished representative of France here, Ambassador Levitte. And I would like to welcome the efforts of the French presidency to establish greater order in the various political, economic, social spheres, and also with respect to food security. Concerning the economic crisis, I also would like to underscore the fact that obviously we need this differentiation, this distinction between different countries, but here in Geneva, we have international organizations like the ILO, like UNCTAD, this has just been said, that also emphasize the need to have growth in order to create jobs. I think that this also deserves to be taken into account by us, by Europeans, and I think we could look at the matter of Greece, if this could be solved by austerity measures alone. Do we not need a further balance with respect to an investment program conducive to promoting growth? We have to look at the existing financial capacities in European countries in this regard. My second point has to do with the social sphere. I welcome the efforts of the French presidency to emphasize employment and the social floor. We welcome the efforts of the G20 concerning this new concept of social protection floor. I was able to attend the meeting last June, and I have to say that this work will be continued next year in order to achieve a clear recommendation in this regard. And it is my feeling that it is our interest to remain in close contact with the G20 with respect to the outcome in this regard. With respect to financing, I welcome efforts to develop new financing, innovative financing. Would the G20 be ready to recall already existing financing mechanisms in the international sphere, for example, to reserve 0.7% for public development aid on the part of industrialized countries? And my second point is on food security. I welcome efforts to stabilize prices of food products, I believe that the consumers have a major problem when seeing this exponential rise in prices for food products. The consumer's interest is very important, but I would also like to say, would the G20 not also be ready at preserving the interests of consumers, but also the interest of producers, and especially the small-scale producers? If we have 1 billion people suffering from hunger and malnutrition, it is because we have 3/4 of the small producers, the small scale holders, who are suffering. Now, if we want more food security, we cannot remain standing here. Could the G20 not make progress towards a formulation stating that we need to have fair, more remunerative prices for producers and accessible prices for consumers? I think that the G20 is dealing with a very important dimension, but if we could broaden this further, I think that we could be more effective. Would it not be possible to join the Council of Europe? I think that we Europeans are very involved in development issues. I think at this level, it would be very important for the G20 to have the support of the Council of Europe. Thank you, Ambassador. We can't deal with all of your questions. I will try to be brief, otherwise we would have to spend the whole day. I'd like to leave time for other colleagues as well. For Greece, you're right, entirely right. We have to reestablish accounts there, but we have to relaunch the economic machinery as well. And that is what the Europeans are concerned about. I will surprise you, perhaps. Greece is entitled to major European structural funds. It's a catch-up exercise for those who are below the average gold level. This is paradoxical. They do not consume very much, and I have to say, this is because their administration is not strong enough. They are not equipped to make requests in Brussels so that they would receive all of the funds to which they're entitled. Together with the Greek government, we are working on regulating this dual issue. We are seeing to it how we can improve the administration in Greece to become more equipped. And we have brought this up with the Prime Minister of Greece last Friday, and to see how we can work with President Papandreou. There are European funds that are to reach Greece more effectively and in greater volume so that it can be more effective. We have measures to accompany the handling of the debt problem of this country and its financial machinery. With respect to social protection, I've spoken about this. You're right. I agree with you. I simply would like to stress some intertwined notions. First of all, no country should feel that it does not need a social protection floor. Stating this here is self-evident. And how can we not note that our countries that you represent, are in economic, financial, and social situations that differ from one another? That's why I stressed social protection floors in the plural. Now, the approach. First of all, a consensus so that all countries adopt a social protection floor covering the various areas. And second, each and every one of our countries should commit itself to noting that growth is there, that the general living conditions improve, to strengthening that social protection floor. And then progressively, there will be a type of convergence between countries, formerly the industrialized countries, the emergency countries that are catching up, and the developing countries that must join the general dynamism. And the second point, with respect to financing development, and I say this very emphatically, we reaffirm, and we must reaffirm, this 0.7% objective. It's not that there are financial difficulties that we have to give up on this objective, and that is why I recall that for France's part, we have had progressive growth, and last year it was at 0.5% of GDP. But beyond this, public aid for development is insufficient. I said that it was approximately 20 billion per year, and obviously we need in 2020 to have 100 billion to assist developing countries to face up to the problem of global warming. We assumed this commitment in Copenhagen. And we have to assist a number of countries to face up to the present crisis and to achieve the Millennium objective goals in 2015. And I'm speaking before Michel Kasitsky. And in health, for example, we have protection floors that are necessary in order to achieve these Millennium goals. Now, if you calculate all of this, you will note that we do not escape the establishment of innovative financing. I said this very strongly. A very limited but a broadly based transaction tax is one of the solutions. It's not the only one. It is one solution. And we would like a large number of countries to join us in this effort. But if this is not the case, we would like, at least for a group of pioneer countries, to move on this issue with the French and some others for this transaction tax to show that this can work. Bill Gates' report will be much broader. This report will cover a number of possible innovative financing mechanisms. I'll just be giving you two examples. I'm in Geneva, so I'll mention WHO, which states rightly that in a number of countries, one way to fight against the excessive consumption of tobacco is to increase the taxes on tobacco. Why not a percentage of this amount being turned back to assist developing countries to fight against global warming? And you have very low taxation on transport. I'm thinking about maritime transport and air transport. One way to fight against global warming, and here I'm saying this in Geneva again, is through increasing fiscal measures, tax on transport. This would lead to a reduction in greenhouse gases, and of course, considerable financial resources that would be released could in part be allocated to fighting against global warming. Bill Gates will be presenting this menu to heads of state and government at the Cannes Summit. With a great deal of conviction, President Sarkozy will ask all of the countries represented in the room to commit themselves to adopting at least one of Bill Gates' proposals and to implementing it, and if possible, several of these options, so that we will meet the objectives that we assumed in Copenhagen, 100 billion for 2020, in order to fight against climate warming. Now, with respect to food security, finally, we need to fight against speculation. It's abnormal that the price of wheat has doubled in just a few months' time. It's not due to sudden drought or a flooding, but rather the result of speculation on the derivatives markets. And we would like to impose a number of rules. And we are making progress in this area and seeking to limit excessive price flows, which cause victims, either producers or consumers, depending. Now, I think that we also have to think about the long term. We need to reinvest in agriculture. If you look at the work of the World Bank, you note that over decades, the World Bank, the regional development banks have not invested in agriculture. And we are emphasizing this again this year. We are asking everyone who has the means, the major development banks in particular, to make more means available for agricultural investment, especially in Africa, but not only, throughout the world. We need to reinvest in agriculture, especially to the benefit of small producers responsible for the bulk of agricultural production. And that is the only way that we will be able to feed the 9 billion people who will be alive in 2050. And I must assure you, we have 1 billion people suffering daily from hunger. That is unacceptable. This figure alone explains why the French presidency for the G20 wishes to focus on food insecurity and wishes to focus on agricultural production.
Raquel González, sindical.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez, and then Ambassador Pan from Singapore.
Thank you very much, Director General, and thank you, Ambassador Levitte, for a very interesting presentation. It will not surprise you that from the international labor movement, we very much welcome the conclusions of the labor and employment ministers, and in particular the acknowledgement that there is a need to re-emphasize employment as a key objective of economic policy. And of course, we very much hope that beyond the labor and employment ministers, this message will be heard by the finance minister, who are going to meet in a few days' time in Paris, and of course by the G20 leaders who will meet in November in Cannes. We say that because we believe that it is really essential at this stage of the crisis that spending be directed towards job creation and towards the real economy. And we also believe that much more needs to be done to regulate the financial sector. And I was glad to hear the comments that you made in that regard, and in particular the fact that this will be an important element of the discussion in Cannes. We believe indeed that much more needs to be done to regulate the financial sector, especially because at the moment we see that many countries have been forced to adopt a consolidation strategy and measures in the countries, which regrettably have resulted in jobs being lost, in wages or social protection being cut, and in a way undermining the need and undermining the capacity of demand to increase, which we thought from the very beginning of the crisis needed to be addressed. So we believe, as was recognized, by the way, already in Washington by the employment and labor ministers, that we need to have a greater focus on the demand side of exit strategies to the crisis. We certainly support supply side measures. They are certainly an important element to get out of the crisis. But we need to also adopt income-led growth strategies. Hence, and it's not the first time that you hear it from the international labor movement, we would also like to see a greater focus on wages and on the central role of collective bargaining as a key element of redistribution of growth in society and in the labor market. We very much welcome the focus given by France on the ILO Core Convention and the strong call made on ratification and implementation. We believe it is essential, and in particular when we talk about Convention 87, freedom of association, 98, collective bargaining, which have been identified by the Social Justice Declaration as the enabling rights and what lies at the core of what the International Labour Organization is about. I would also like to remind that we have adopted the Global Jobs Pact in the ILO as a tripartite response to the crisis, and that indeed core labor standards were at the core of the strategy, but the Global Jobs Pact also identified a whole set of international labor standards that it identified as relevant to the crisis, and I think it would be also good to look back at those as well. We certainly also welcome the focus on the social protection floor. This is a step in the good direction at looking at the demand side of an exit strategy, and we believe that the ILO has a key role to play in that regard. You certainly know that next year the conference will be discussing the possible adoption of a recommendation on the social protection floor. So beyond what every single country is willing to do in terms of a social protection floor, certainly the ILO can provide universal guidance to those states, and certainly, of course, also bearing in mind the need to continue to work on the vertical extension of social protection reflected in Convention 102 of the ILO. We certainly also welcome the reference that you have made to the financial transaction tax and the fact that France supports it. This is certainly also very much supported by the International Trade Union Confederation. So to conclude a question which I know may be difficult for you to answer, but could you maybe give us your views as to the extent to which the conclusions that have been adopted by the Labour and Employment Ministers will be taken into account and reflected in the discussion and conclusions of the Finance Ministers and the G20 leaders in Cannes? Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam, for your comments. Well, since we agree on everything, I won't have any very long comments to make, but I will try to respond to your last question. We're 1 month away from the summit, so there will be a number of meetings yet. I mentioned one, which President Sarkozy is particularly interested in, which relates to the social dimension of the Cannes Summit, and that's going to be held in Paris with the participation of the civil society. And that underlines the importance that France gives to the social dimension in the conclusions of the summit. There will be indeed a meeting of the Ministers of Finance, and in the few days before the summit, there will be some work carried out day and night by the 20 Sherpas of the summit in order to come up with a text. And here I'd like to turn to two former colleagues. I think it'll be 2 or 3 days of very intense intensive work, since we're going to have to reconcile points of view that may not be divergent exactly, but different nevertheless, since there's the responsibilities of ministers of finance on the one hand, ministers of the employment on the other hand. They're not always the same. So it's the role of the Sherpas and to the heads of state to come up with a consolidation of these points of view. And I'm very optimistic as far as this is concerned. That is, that the social dimension be taken into account in this plan of action for growth and for employment that we intend to adopt in Cannes. I think that we will be successful. In any case, do not underestimate the determination of President Sarkozy to do everything possible in order to ensure that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jean-David Levitte. It's been many years since we last met in New York, and welcome this time back to Geneva. And I would like to, in addition to thanking you personally, also welcome the increasing interaction between the G20 and the relevant multilateral organizations by both the current chair, France, as well as previous chairs of the G20. And I would like to urge that subsequent chairs of the G20 continue with this very useful interaction. And I think a word of thanks is also in order to thank France for its particular engagement with the Global Governance Group in Geneva over the issue of labor and social matters, which is a matter of high priority on the French presidency's agenda. And in April this year, this group called the Global Governance Group, or the 3G in short, we put together our collective minds and we contributed some of our thoughts to the G20 process through a paper which was submitted to the senior officials meeting of the G20 in April. So for that, we thank you. And I think, Ambassador Levitte, you may have already heard this ad nauseum in your many consultations, that what the G20 has done and the work of the G20, as you had briefed just now, is actually something which is really encompasses global governance. And it really touches on issues which will affect G20 members as well as non-G20 members, and which is why the 3G group had been consistently working together with the G20 to try to enhance the transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness of the G20 process, so that whatever the G20 does enhances multilateral organizations like the United Nations, like the ILO, and not diminish them. And in this respect, again, you may have already heard this term, variable geometry. How do we have a balance between having legitimacy of decisions which are made in truly multilateral forums like the UN and the ILO versus the need for effectiveness, especially in times of crisis as we are being faced with now. And one of the concrete ideas which this global governance group had suggested that the G20 may want to embrace maybe more in a more concerted effort is what we call variable geometry. So on specific substantive issues, you may want to choose different subsets of countries which may have either the relevant experience or the relevant expertise or the relevant interest in that particular matter, so that their inputs could also be sought in the G20 process. And hopefully in that way we can help to have a right balance between legitimacy and effectiveness. And I know that in each subsequent G20 presidency, I think it is commendable that I noticed that each G20 presidency has indeed tried to do that. And I think that's something that we should continue to urge the G20 to try to do. And finally, for the Cannes Summit, I hope that the Cannes Summit will come out with a very clear and unequivocal message that there is a need to strengthen sound global governance so that we can relaunch economic growth, create jobs, say no definitely to protectionism, and also to ensure that there is sustained efforts by all key actors, including from the G20, to improve on your coordination and implementation of economic and financial policies. And I think that is something which we are all looking forward to, and we hope that the Cannes Summit will indeed be able to deliver such a very clear and firm message. Thank you.
Merci, Madame l'Ambassadeur.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and I'm very happy to meet you again here. First of all, it's true that G20 is working extremely well with the 3G group. We appreciate their contribution very much. We do ask for their advice, and this is a very effective, I feel, form of responsibility sharing. And so I think we absolutely must continue with this partnership, and I'm convinced that tomorrow the Mexican presidency will continue this dialogue, which is very efficient and based on trust with this 3G group. So in the same way, we're also very concerned about ensuring that there are observers within the G20. There were very strict rules that were adopted by consensus. They can only be modified by consensus. And I think that Singapore is benefiting from this, as the United Arab Emirates and representative of the Economic Council for the Gulf States. Africa also has a second seat, which is taken up by Ethiopia. And that's a way of increasing our outreach to countries of the G20. And beyond that, it's the dialogue that we're holding today that needs to be maintained on a daily basis. The 9 ambassadors, Jean-Baptiste Mattei, I would like to thank him very much for his work. We are constantly alert to this. Now, you stressed the difficulty of efficiency, legitimacy, and I think the great difficulty in governance, global governance in our century, is to try to combine effectiveness with legitimacy. Now, when the economic crisis abruptly started in the autumn of 2008, nobody thought that a special meeting of the United Nations would enable us to come up with any kind of solution at all. And beyond the platform of the United Nations, President Sarkozy, who was at that time president of the EU, launched the idea of having a summit, and that became the G20 Summit, which met in Washington. And at that time, nobody thought of raising the question whether it is legitimate to do this, because everyone expected from the summit an emergency formula to repair the financial system. And today, I think that everyone expects from Cannes a formula, a recipe for necessary decisions to be taken in order to ensure we do not fall back into recession. Now, maybe today, together, we represent 85% of the global GDP. Nevertheless, we're very aware of the existence and also, why not call it that, the frustrations that the G20 represents. That is, all the countries that are not members of the G20. And the responsibility of the presidency is to do everything possible in order to hear, to listen, to consult, to share with all the countries of the G175, the UN countries. And that is why President Sarkozy, right at the beginning in January, went to Addis Ababa. It was the summit of the African Union, and it enabled him to meet up with all the heads of African states present there. And each time that there's a possibility to share, to listen, we do grasp that opportunity. But to come back to what I was saying originally, within your assembly, a number of countries organize themselves. They have affinities to dialogue, to get their message through. And I think this is a very effective, a pragmatic way of responding to this very difficult dialectic between efficiency and legitimacy. So thank you very much for your comment and for your question. Well, dear Ambassador Jean-David Levitte, thank you very much. I know that you have further activities. First of all, I would like to thank you for the great wealth of comments that you have made and this willingness to listen, to take up, to meet the concerns expressed in the room here. A number of thoughts were expressed. Well, thank you very much for coming here to the ILO and strengthening the link that exists between the ILO and the G20. And thank you also. I think that you heard many times the expression of real economies. And when we have employers that invest, we have workers that fuel the enterprises, we have the social aspect of governments. And when we have all that, we all feel very much part and parcel of the real economy. If we can all, we get a feeling that we are all thinking about some very complex aspects that we have experience of. Just a final comment. This world of the real economy has the feeling today that it's the financial operators that are that are in charge of the global economy. It wasn't always the case. It was the other way around. The real economy was in charge and at the steering wheel. And we need to come back to a real economy, which encompasses global economy. And for reasons that you have mentioned, it's probably within the G20 that this process should take form, should make progress. But this is a feeling, a request, a conviction that exists here in this House, that it all comes back to the real economy, a space that is their own in economic stability, and it is only then that we'll have real results that will be tried and proven in time. So thank you very much again. It was wonderful to hear you, wonderful that you should be here, and I'm sure that we're all reassured on the political will of President Sarkozy, on the French presidency, and the commitment to the Cannes conclusions, and we're sure that everything will happen the way that you have said. Thank you very much.